Welcome everybody to our today's webinar, which I call the webinar of the year, hosted or brought to you by LRN and Miyaka. Before we start, some brief housekeeping rules. So the session will be recorded and will be shared to all attendees via email, including all the contact information of the guest speakers. Question and answer, please via the chat or the question and answer button. For that, today in today's webinar, we have two superstars from the compliance field. We have a former corruption violator who turned into compliance consultant, Richard Bistrong, and we have a really famous whistleblower, Tyler Shultz, who is the leading voice in speaking up and listening. Today's webinar will explore the real-world ethics and compliance dilemma, what went wrong, how was it addressed, and what others can learn from the experience. This is not just theory, this is a human side of compliance and integrity in action. And without further delay, I would like to hand over to Amy Hannan from LRN.
Thank you, Stefan, and also to the Miyaka organization for co-hosting this webinar and discussion today. I'm Amy Hannan, the Chief Marketing Officer here at LRN, and I'm very pleased to provide an introduction to both our superstars, as Stefan kindly said, Richard Bistrong and Tyler Shultz. I do have a little bit of content here to share as part of the introduction, so I do ask for forgiveness from our audience while I read out a couple of paragraphs of intro. I don't want to get any of this content wrong. So first, please join me in welcoming Richard Bistrong to our webinar stage here. Richard has spent much of his career as an international sales executive and currently consults and speaks on foreign bribery, ethics, and compliance issues from that frontline perspective. Richard was the Vice President of International Sales for a large publicly traded manufacturer of police and military equipment, which included residing and working in the UK. In 2007, as part of a cooperation agreement with the United States Department of Justice and subsequent immunity from prosecution in the UK, Richard assisted the United States, UK, and other governments in their understanding of how FCPA, bribery, and other export violations occurred and operated in international sales. In 2012, Richard was sentenced as part of his own plea agreement for violating the FCPA and served 14 and a half months at a federal prison camp, returning home in December 2013. Since 2014, Richard has presented to hundreds of diverse global multinationals. His talks focus on anti-bribery, ethics, and compliance challenges, sharing his frontline experience and perspective on real-world corruption and compliance risk. Richard has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the New York Times, among other periodicals. In 2020, Richard was named by Refinitiv as one of the top 100 social influencers in risk and compliance. And Richard's work and research have also recently been published in the Harvard Business Review and Fast Company. Everybody, please join me in welcoming Richard. And also, we have thank you, Tyler.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Stefan.
We also have Tyler Shultz with us, of course. Theranos promised to revolutionize the healthcare industry, raised nearly $1 billion in funding, attained a $9 billion valuation, and assembled a high-powered board of directors of former secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, four-star generals, and senators. Tyler was 22 years old, fresh out of college, and eager to join a company that was being touted as, quote, the Apple of healthcare. He quickly realized, however, that behind the facade of a charismatic founder, powerful board, high-profile investors, and magazine cover stories, Theranos was built on lies. Tyler reported Theranos to regulators and became a key source for the Wall Street Journal's investigative reporting, which triggered a wave of lawsuits and government investigations. The FDA determined that Theranos was selling an unapproved medical device, forcing the company to halt its highly touted nanotainer. Everybody put a pin in that. We'll find out what a nanotainer is shortly. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services found that Theranos laboratory practices produced dangerously inaccurate results, putting patients' health in immediate jeopardy, and subsequently banned both Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. The SEC charged Holmes with orchestrating a massive years-long fraud, raising $700 million under false pretenses. Finally, the Department of Justice pursued criminal charges against Holmes and Sunny Balwani. Both were convicted of fraud and sentenced to 11 and 14 years in prison, respectively. And I know there has been some recent reporting around updates around these cases, and I know we'll get to that as part of the Q&A discussion today as well. So please, everybody, join me in welcoming Tyler Shultz to the conversation as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Terrific. I'll be chiming in from time to time, hopefully adding to the conversation with some relevant data points from an E&C benchmarking perspective, taken from some of LRN's decades-long research into the industry as well, primarily from 2 recent publications from LRN, our 2025 Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report, and our forthcoming 2025 Global Study on E&C Program Maturity. This will be the first time we've published research around the maturity of global ethics and compliance programs. So without further ado, I know we want to hear from our 2 star guests. And Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you first to help kick off the discussion and lead in with our first sets of questions.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for the introductions, for moderating today's discussion, and also to you and the entire LRN and Miyaka team for all your support in putting together this very unique conversation, and to welcome Tyler. Also, I see the chat bar coming up and a number of hellos out there. So I think on behalf of all of us, we're saying hello back. And thank you so much for spending what might be your morning, afternoon, or your evening with us. So Tyler, I think let's wind back a little bit. And let's go to what was it like when you first met Elizabeth Holmes? What drew you to go to work for Theranos? How did it all start? I mean, you must have at some point thought this was a great place to work.
Yeah, of course. So I first met Elizabeth actually in my grandfather's living room. And just for a little bit of context there, my grandfather has held more cabinet positions than anyone else in history. He was the Secretary of Treasury for Richard Nixon. He was the Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. But by the time I was in college, he was retired from all those types of jobs, and he was working at Stanford University and had a house that was actually on campus. And one day I got a call from him, and he basically said, I have this brilliant woman coming over to my house. I think you would learn a lot if you came over and listened in on our discussion. So I didn't have a whole lot of context, but I hopped on my bike and biked over to his house. And that's where I met Elizabeth for the first time. And she was wearing her all black outfit, the black turtleneck that was very intentionally modeled after Steve Jobs. She had this really deep, almost monotone but hypnotic voice where when she started speaking, she just captured the attention of the entire room. The room would go silent when she started speaking. And I saw her blue, piercing, unblinking eyes. And that is when I really also heard her lay out her vision for Theranos for the first time. And what she told us was that she dropped out of Stanford when she was 19 years old and invented this revolutionary blood testing technology in her uncle's basement that could do anything a central laboratory could do. But what was even better than that was that she only needed a single drop of blood, and she could run these tests anywhere where you had access to electricity. So these tests could be run in medevac helicopters, in operating rooms, in Walgreens, in Safeways, in patients' homes. It seemed like a technology that just had no limitations and truly had the ability to change the way we practice healthcare on a really large scale. So I was super, super excited about both Elizabeth and the vision of the company, and I just knew it was something that I wanted to work on. So I stayed in touch with Elizabeth, and working at Theranos happened to be my first job out of college.
So what was your college degree in, and what sort of work did you start doing at Theranos? What was that like?
So at the time when I met Elizabeth, my degree was in mechanical engineering. But after she kind of started becoming a little bit like a mentor to me, she convinced me to try to take more biology and chemistry. And I ended up switching my major from mechanical engineering to biology about halfway through my senior year. Somehow managed to graduate on time. But yeah, I did have a degree in biology. And when I first joined the company, the first lab that I worked in, which I only worked in for first an internship and then for 4 days as a full-time employee, was like a research lab where, looking back, one of the biggest red flags was that no one I worked with in that lab, and there were people who had been there for 3, 4, 5 years, none of them had ever seen the product that we were working on. That's how secretive things were.
Okay. And by the way, Tyler mentioned that Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford, I think. Correct.
Yes.
So if you're interested in a great Netflix series, I think it's called The Dropout. So just as an aside. So Tyler, what what were like the first red flags that you observed that gave you cause for maybe like pausing, like where you started to think, what's going on here? What did that look like?
Yeah, so my very first day as a full-time employee, there were a few red flags that popped out.
Okay.
And it was a very, I don't know what the right word is, but like exciting but tumultuous time to join the company because Theranos had been in stealth mode for 11 years by the time
Hmm.
I joined. And the day that I joined the company was the day we came out of stealth mode and launched the product. And Elizabeth did this big ribbon cutting ceremony at the first Walgreens in Palo Alto that would offer the Theranos tests. So it was super exciting, right? And you really did feel like you were at the apple of healthcare. But also on my first day, I remember I was staying with a group of scientists and someone came over and said, "Oh, Sarika's out in the parking lot crying. She had some sort of screaming match with Elizabeth and Sunny and was like essentially fired on the spot." And so I didn't know who this person was or what the background was, but apparently she was the manager of what was called the validation team. And the validation team, their job is to make sure that the blood tests actually work. They're validated before you test real patients. And she had told Elizabeth and Sunny that it was not ready to launch. And then suddenly they had launched the product, despite her warnings. And so that's what the disagreement was about. And then the manager of my team pulled our team aside. And again, we had never seen the product. But what our manager told us was that even though we had just launched this product, patients could go into Walgreens and get their finger pricked, maybe. Um, we had 0 tests that were actually validated on the platform. So if a patient walked into Walgreens, first of all, they would not get the finger prick, they would get a needle in the arm, and then none of those tests would be run on Theranos equipment. We would either send the blood out to other laboratories or we would test the blood on third-party labs that we had purchased, um, from companies like Roche and Siemens. Um, and an interesting tidbit there is that Theranos actually used shell corporations to buy the third-party equipment so that investors and board members and whoever else, it would be a hard time to find out that they were buying that third-party equipment. But to me, it was a huge red flag because we just launched the product, but we weren't using it in any way, shape, or form. We were pretending to use it when we were not.
Okay, so I want to challenge you there. First, can you remind us who Sonny is, just for those who might not be familiar with him?
Sure, yeah. So Sunny was the president and COO of the company, but he was also a somewhat early investor in the company. He's also a board member, and probably most importantly, he was also Elizabeth's boyfriend,
Okay.
who was about 20 years older than her.
Right. So winding back again, you're now going to product launch. And this isn't just any product. This is a product where a doctor might diagnose a blood exam and recommend a procedure or a medication. When people's lives depend on this, you now have the knowledge that it doesn't exist. Like, you know that this equipment and this technology isn't there. Like,
Well, I don't know if I would say at that point on that first day, I don't know if
okay,
I'd go far as to say I knew it didn't exist. I would say I knew it wasn't being used,
okay.
but I hadn't seen it yet.
So Did you have a inclination that hey, I need to speak up about this like right away? I've got this knowledge, even if it's not as firm as I might have represented. Was there any part of you that said, I need to talk to someone about this?
Not at all. I was guzzling the Kool-Aid. Like I was so passionate about Theranos and I really believed in and trusted Elizabeth. I felt like I was in the presence of like a Steve Jobs. And without, it was my first day, first week. It was mostly confusion, It was a mixture of excitement, but also like kind of scratching your head a little bit. But at that point in time, there was no urge for me to feel like speaking up.
Okay. And, I think this is not the first example of a charismatic leader having an impact on people's mindset in terms of following along. So we've seen that before and after. But moving along, did you start to see more red flags that then initiated, okay, I need to talk to someone about this? So what did those first red flags look like?
Yeah, so the next big red flag happened at the end of my first week as a full-time employee when we got an email from Sunny that basically said, stop all of your research experiments. Everyone is being moved to the validation team. And kind of the story we learned was that people had just been quitting from that team because they were working through the night trying to get some tests validated on the Theranos platform. So they just needed more hands on deck. And what they really considered it the front lines of the company, so much so that the lab that had all the Theranos devices was even called Normandy. Like you're storming the beaches of Normandy, which I don't know if that's really the right imagery that they should have been going for. But so we all got moved into this Normandy lab. And as part of our onboarding into the validation team, we got to see what was called the Open Reader, which was one of the Theranos devices that didn't have the shell on it. So you could see exactly what was inside. You could see exactly what it was doing. And the first time I'm seeing this is the first time my manager is seeing this because we were moved over together.
Oh,
And I remember my manager looking at this demo and she just turned to the woman who was running the demonstration. She just said, "Do you think this is cool?" And the woman shrugged her shoulders and said, "I'll let you decide for yourself," and walked away. And at that moment, I realized there's an open secret, at least in the scientific community of this company, that the technology flat out does not exist. Because what we saw was a very rudimentary 8-channel pipette on a robotic arm. There was no microfluidics, there was no new signal transduction method. From a first glance, at least, it looked like everything in there was purchased off the shelf and just kind of assembled. There was nothing really revolutionary at all about it. It could only test for one thing at a time, not the hundreds of things that Elizabeth had claimed. And it didn't even function very well. Like it would constantly break, the pipette tips would fall off, they would get stuck in the gears. It was just a total disaster.
so what did Tyler Schultz do about that?
So that's when I started at that point in time. First, I would say I started building allies. Like I started like communicating um, with colleagues and managers and building trust with them and started to like kind of like validate my own ideas. Like, are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing or am I crazy? And everyone said, no, 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 you're not crazy. Does not work. This is not how science is supposed to be done. And in that period of time, more red flags started piling on. So just real quickly, by the time I left the company, we did have 7 tests that were validated on the Theranos platform. And in order to test real patients, you have to get something called a CLIA certification from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, who oversees laboratories. And
Mhm.
when the inspectors came to give us that certification, we locked the doors to Normandy. So no one was going in or out of that lab that day. The regulators were only shown the third-party equipment. So to me, that was another huge red flag where I thought executives are intentionally hiding the Theranos product from the regulators. Then we participated in essentially like a safety audit where, in this case, the New York State Department of Health sent out samples, blinded samples to labs across the country. Everyone gets the same sample. You're supposed to test it and send back the results. And when we got that sample, we split it and we ran it both on Theranos equipment and on the third-party equipment. And in some cases, the results were off by more than 300%. So these results are not coming back anywhere close to the same. And the executives decided to only report the third-party results, not the Theranos results. So to me, that was a clear indication that management knew that these tests didn't work. And when there was a regulator who knew the right answer, they knew we can't possibly report a Theranos result. But if it was an unsuspecting patient who would have no idea if the answer was correct or not, they were perfectly comfortable knowingly giving them incorrect medical information. And then for me, a lot of these problems came to a head when we validated a test for syphilis. And when we tested known positives for syphilis, we got like only 65% correct, and then we deleted it and tried again. And the second time we got 80% correct. And then to test the inverse, we wanted to test to see how often we would get false positives. So we tested samples from ourselves and from our colleagues, and like over 20% of us tested positive for syphilis. And we all just assumed this test doesn't work. But when we sent off the data to the statistics team, they crunched the numbers, they passed off a report to the medical director who signed off and said this test is safe and effective, and we're going to start testing real patients for syphilis. And when I got that news, I literally felt physically sick. Like I felt like I had been punched in the stomach because I knew that something I was directly contributing to was absolutely going to hurt people. There was not a shred of doubt. And that is when I started feeling like I really need to do more here. And that's when I started essentially barking up every tree I could possibly bark up. So I contacted government regulators at the New York State Department of Health. So that's when I first unknowingly became a whistleblower. And then I talked to my managers. I had a direct conversation with Elizabeth. So I talked to the CEO. She set me up with conversations with the vice president. So I raised concerns with him. And then ultimately, I wrote a lot of my concerns in an email that was then shared with Sunny. I also shared my concerns with my grandfather, who was on the board. So just like the quick list is I shared concerns with colleagues, managers, a vice president, the COO and president, the CEO, a board member, regulators. Nothing happened.
So I guess one might think, then why didn't you just walk into the parking lot and say, I'm out of here?
Yeah, it's a great question. The reason I didn't do that immediately was because I felt like, first of all, I felt like I had built a personal relationship with Elizabeth. She was my mentor. She was someone I trusted. She was also becoming almost like part of my family. By this point in time, she had actually come to 3 of my family Christmases. She was coming to Thanksgivings and birthday parties. And I felt like it is my duty to this person that I know and trust to make sure that she's aware of these concerns. And I thought it was my duty as a good employee to raise these concerns. If I just quit quietly and didn't raise these alarm bells, I would not be being a good employee. So I felt like in order to be a good employee and in order to help Elizabeth, I needed to start raising my concerns more vocally. And, um, but after I did that and I was essentially chased out of the building, then I felt like I was at a loss. I didn't know what else to do. I felt like, again, I'd barked up every tree I could bark up. I didn't know where to go. So I kind of moved on with my life for a little bit. Um, but then it wasn't until then eventually a Wall Street Journal reporter reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm doing a story on Theranos. Would you want to talk to me?" And it's really interesting because it wasn't until a reporter reached out and a reporter started asking questions and a reporter started publishing information that then things started moving. Then all of a sudden the board pays attention. Then all of a sudden the regulators pay attention. And so what I learned is that the government regulators really do respond to the collective consciousness of the people that they represent.
Yeah.
And the best way to inform that is through really good reporting.
So can you give us, I mean, you've certainly given us a feel for tone at the top, but it seems like the mentality at Theranos was this exception mentality, right? And the culture was like, we need to do this for the business. Compliance and ethics issues aside, that still is a challenge in our world of bribery and corruption, where sort of the ethics and compliance teams are overrun by their commercial colleagues. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think over and over and over again, Theranos and its executives were presented with situations where it felt like in the short term, the best thing for the business is to take a shortcut. And they kind of lost sight of the long-term vision and outcomes. And I even put this in my email to Elizabeth. Like when I raised my concerns in this email to Elizabeth, I concluded the email by saying, I apologize if this email sounds attacking in any way. It is not meant to be. I'm dedicated to the long-term vision of this company, but I'm worried that some of our short-term practices will prevent us from reaching our long-term goals. And little did I know how true that statement was. I said that based on things that I was seeing in the labs, but kind of to your point, these are cultural problems. These types of problems aren't isolated to just, one laboratory in one corner of the building. It was everywhere. It was the way that they treated product development in general. So one of the concerns that I raised was that we launch a product or that we launch a test, and then we're constantly changing how the algorithm works and how the assay works on the back end. As real patients are coming in, we're constantly changing it. And Sunny in his reply to me says this is called product development through iteration, you know, and it's a total, like, once you launch a medical product like that, you're not supposed to touch it. Essentially, they're evading the regulations in order to tweak and hopefully improve their tests. But in doing so, they're really treating these patients like test subjects, not like patients. Um, there were instances where this is something really interesting that the SEC found, that there were instances where Elizabeth told prospective investors that their revenue the previous year was $100 million, when in the short term, when in reality, it was actually only $100,000. And so you keep finding instances like this where I'm sure it felt like, oh, we just need to bring the money in. We just need to like exaggerate this one thing a little bit and we'll bring more money in. And you just keep doing these shortcuts and shortcuts and shortcuts, and you just end up digging yourself into this hole that you can't get yourself out of. And you build a culture of taking shortcuts instead of building a culture of being able to solve hard problems the right way.
Richard, there is so much that Tyler just raised here that also resonated for me based on some of the discussions we've had around your own experience. So how about that for you, right? Did anyone at your organization say to you, well, we shouldn't be doing this, or we shouldn't be doing it this way? Or was management giving you mixed signals sort of in the same way where Tyler was expressing that concern around exceptions and long-term versus short-term practices?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Tyler's experience really struck a chord with me. And again, appreciating that cheating's always a choice, right? So these decisions were no one's fault but my own. But, when you can have a culture where all that is discussed, and the only signals you're getting are get the business done, right? As Tyler shared, it was, we need to raise money. We need to show investors that we're successful for our next round in investment. I worked for a public company, and it was, we need to just keep growing quarter after quarter. That was the signal. There was no signal on the importance of, well, how we get things done is just as important as the volume of getting things done. And I think that really became obvious when, during a few years of my 10-year international sales career, for 2 years, the market went into rapid decline. And I'm at our sales forecasting meeting, and they're asking me for my forecast for the next year, when the 3 years prior were just dramatic growth, right? Knocked the forecast right out of the ballpark. And I'm like, well, this year is not going to be like the last 3 years. There's a number of reasons why the market is in rapid decline. I don't know what to say, except our international sales are going to fall off a cliff. And I remember a senior C-suite person just said, look, we're a public company. Our sales don't fall off a cliff. Now, my responsibility was saying, then you need to find someone who can figure out how to increase sales in a declining market. I took that as a signal as do whatever you need to do whatever it takes to keep this trajectory going. So it doesn't have to be, oh, we need you to violate the law, right? So Tyler didn't get that message, like, oh, go ahead and falsify data. But you read between the lines, and it becomes, as Tyler said, one big open secret.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, a lot of it does come from the tone in which those things are told to you. And Sonny was like a very tough person. Like he wasn't the type of person that you had discussions with. He really just barked orders. And to give you like a bit of color on the type of person he was, when they first were notified that there was a source for the Wall Street Journal, that they had a whistleblower, he texted Elizabeth. And it's really interesting with all these lawsuits that have come out that you get to see some of these text messages that you were unaware of at the time. But he texted Elizabeth and said, I've narrowed it down to 5 people. We're going to nail this mother effer. And Elizabeth says, like, if it's Tyler, I need to get ahead of it and get to George. And Sonny's response is knocking legs off one at a time is the best way. Like he spoke and acted as if he was a mob boss. Like he wanted to be a bully, and he absolutely was a total bully. Like there were instances where quality controls would fail and he would bully employees into running patient samples anyway, which would be another example where you know the test doesn't work because the quality control failed. And here you have this bulldog of a COO come in and demand that lower level employees run these tests anyway. And the culture was just completely driven by fear, where no one felt comfortable enough to raise concerns. And that culture of fear was incredibly intentional. And what Elizabeth and Sonny did over the course of over a decade by the time I got there is whenever someone raised concerns, they fired that person, and they did it very publicly. And in some cases, after firing that person, they even sued them. And when they sued former employees, they sent out company-wide emails about it, where, like you said, if you read between the lines, what they're saying is, we will sue you too. If you get in our way, we will ruin your life. And you do that over 10 years. And the people who are left are kind of the type of people who will just do whatever they're told, who aren't going to fight back, who aren't going to raise concerns. And Elizabeth and Sonny did that so intentionally. I think a really important message for the people on this call right now is that you can take that idea, but use it for good at your own companies. Like think about the cultures that you want to build and take every single opportunity that you have to reinforce that culture, whether it's transparency and openness or, whatever it is for your specific organization.
Yeah, and
I would add to that, sorry, Richard, add to that, Tyler, psychological safety. I think that's a lot of what you've just been talking about, and how psychological safety and encouraging a culture that helps to promote and advance that is, one of the single most impactful drivers for ensuring that when misconduct is taking place within your organization, that people feel safe and empowered to speak up, using the appropriate channels.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a point about having those appropriate channels. So Theranos didn't have any sort of internal whistleblowing channel. There was no compliance officer. And in some ways, I feel like that sets the bar way too low, because I have spoken to companies where they say like, oh, well, we have a reporting channel. So, we're done. We've done it. Mission accomplished. And it's so much more than that. Of course, you need a compliance officer, and of course, you need an internal reporting channel, but you need people to use it. In order to get people to use it, you need to build the culture, and you need to create these positive feedback loops where people do feel safe and they feel comfortable, and they've used these types of resources before and they've had positive outcomes. Again, they practice on the small things so that when the big one happens, they know who they can trust, they know the right places to go with their reporting. It is so much more than just putting in place an email or any other kind of whistleblowing channel.
And thank you, Amy and Tyler, for raising the issue of psychological safety. A good reading assignment here for anyone who hasn't is Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization. Amy having written the paradigm on psychological safety. And what she talks about is the opposite of it, which is what Tyler's been sharing. It's dangerous silence, right? Where people feel intimidated, they feel like they're not heard, and they feel like if they are heard, nothing's going to be done, and it could have the opposite effect, as Tyler shared. And the other part of dangerous silence is when management isn't reaching out to anyone to saying, how are things going? Like, tell us what we don't know, right? Like, we want to make things better. We want process improvement. So, as I think Tyler has well described, Elizabeth, Sonny, and their level weren't asking for information, and people were intimidated to give it. That is like the true definition of dangerous silence.
Yeah. And I've even, when I've given talks like this, I've had board members come and say, like, I want to implement this at one of the companies I'm on the board of, but my CEO is actually very reluctant. Like they almost like don't want this type of information. And what I said is like, the way you need to frame this to the CEO is being able to hear what your employees aren't telling you is a superpower. Like if you could do that, if you could just hear what they're not saying, you would think that is an absolute superpower. And putting in place these types of cultures and tools gives you that superpower. It allows you to identify problems in their earliest stages and address them when they're the most easy to address, when you can, before they've metastasized and grown into these problems that could kill your organization, you have the opportunity to address them so much earlier.
So well said. And as Tyler has described, ethical challenges and issues, they age like milk, not wine, right? So the earlier you address misconduct, any type of ethical lapse, the easier it is to course correct. So, but Tyler, I want to leave time for questions. I see we have a few. Like, wind us down. What was like your last days at Theranos like?
Yeah, to kind of zip through the end here to get a little bit of
Yeah.
closure for everybody. Um, they chased me out the door, obviously. And then when I spoke to the Wall Street Journal reporter, they came after me with everything they had. They hired someone who's known as the #1 corporate gun in America to legally come after me. Someone who he's known for shredding Bill Gates in the infamous US government versus Microsoft monopoly lawsuit. And they hid lawyers in my grandfather's house to, in my opinion, try to entrap me. They followed me with private investigators for, I think, more than a year. I ended up spending between $400,000 and $500,000 in legal fees, really defending myself and just trying to stand my ground. They were trying to get me to take back everything that I had said to the Wall Street Journal, and I just wouldn't do it. And I had one really tough conversation with my parents who were footing the bill for a lot of this, where they said that they had just had a conversation with their lawyer and they learned that the best case scenario if I went to court against Theranos was that we would spend $2 million and win. And the worst case scenario was that we would spend more money than that, and then I would go to prison. And they begged me not to pick either option. They said, give up. This is not your problem. This is the responsibility of the FDA, of the FBI, of the Department of Justice, of the SEC. Give up. And I said, what Theranos wants me to say in a written document, an affidavit under penalty of perjury is not true. And I'm not going to say that I'm wrong when I know with 100% certainty that I'm right. And so I stood my ground. I paid a huge legal bill in order to do that, but I stood my ground and just waited until finally the Wall Street Journal started publishing their articles. And it wasn't just one article, it was a series of articles. And that led to a series of investigations that eventually led to the Department of Justice convicting Elizabeth and Sonny of fraud, and they're currently serving 14 and 11 years in prison. And for me, initially, I tried to push away this title of whistleblower. I really did not want to be known as a whistleblower. I went on to start 2 diagnostics companies myself, and I tried to put this story behind me. But kind of what I've realized over the years is that it's actually impossible for me to do that. And instead, what I should do is just embrace the term whistleblower. So it was a big moment for me when I actually went on LinkedIn and changed like the little description to whistleblower. I just put it right on there. It's like, that's what I am. I'm going to embrace it. And once Elizabeth and Sonny went to prison almost 2 years ago now, I thought that it was a really good time for me to actually step away from the crazy startup world and actually start speaking about my experiences at Theranos more intentionally, because I think there are so many stakeholders who have lessons to learn here. You know, it's the employees and executives and compliance officers like all of us here, but it's also investors and board members and regulators and media. And so right now I'm dedicating a little bit of my time just to telling this story and hoping that people can walk away with some really actionable lessons, because unfortunately in a lot of ways I see shades of Theranos everywhere, and in a lot of places I feel like it's almost getting worse, not better.
Okay, so what a shade of Theranos, what would that look like? I mean, I think that's a great terminology, but what would be an example of a shade of Theranos?
I think like a shade of Theranos that probably a lot of people encounter but don't even necessarily notice it is an overreaching NDA. And like the thing that really got me in trouble was the NDAs that I signed with Theranos. And what they were threatening to sue me over was violation of trade secrets and violation of those NDAs. And the core argument between the two of us was they were saying like anything you learn in that building is a trade secret and covered by the NDA. And my point was fraud is not a trade secret, which is why when I finally went on the record with the Wall Street Journal, that is the quote that I gave them. I said, fraud is not a trade secret. And somehow I feel like NDAs have gotten even more overbearing since then. And employees are constantly put in these situations where they feel like they can't talk to a regulator, they can't talk to a lawyer. And the problem with these NDAs is that when people join the companies, they never assume they're going to be in a situation like mine. They're usually very excited to join
Yeah.
that company. And they say hundreds or thousands of other employees have also signed this document. So why wouldn't I sign it? And everyone just kind of blindly signs these agreements that can potentially destroy their lives. And I think the lawyers and companies realize that, and they've just been getting even like more heavy-handed with those types of agreements. So that's one type of example, but every time I give a presentation like this, someone will reach out on LinkedIn or come up to me after and say, I've experienced something very similar, but just at a smaller scale. So maybe they've experienced a lot of these ingredients, but it wasn't a $9 billion company. It was like a
Yeah.
$10 million seed round company. You know, you never know. Um, but these problems are not solved, you know. And so I'm hoping that by speaking about them that I can empower people. And really why I do this is every once in a while someone will reach out to me and say, I was so inspired by your story and I did something at my organization or in my life. And it's just absolutely incredible to get those types of messages.
Well, thank you so much, Tyler. And I feel a blog post coming up, Shades of Theranos, right? Because it
Yeah.
doesn't, not everything has to be a Netflix special or a best-selling book. It's the smaller things that we can impact. But Tyler, look, having read Bad Blood, like, and appreciating the weight of the icon of U.S. foreign policy, George Shultz, your grandfather. I mean, you've been very modest about it, but I appreciate, and having worked with you before, the weight of your grandfather during this whole process. So part of me, and I think this just speaks to the personal side. I mean, I can appreciate how painful this must have been. Was there a part of you, I mean, now that the case is winding down, that's just like, I just don't want to, I just want to put it all in the rearview mirror. So maybe a few parting words on the personal side as to why you're re-experiencing this.
Yeah, I think on the personal side, you know, people kind of they feel like, oh, this story happened a long time ago, but in a lot of ways it didn't. Like Elizabeth and Sonny went to prison
Yeah.
not even 2 years ago, and Sonny never even settled his civil case with the SEC, so we still have one more trial ahead of us. So it's actually not even over. We still have trials ahead. But what I would say is that like I first met Elizabeth when I was 20 years old, when I was in college, and they didn't go to prison till I was 32. So that consumed the entirety of my adult life, the entirety of my 20s. And I think one thing that I did really well is I guess when I was trying to push away that whistleblower stigma, I did kind of move on with my life. I joined a lab at Stanford. I worked at Roche for a bit. I started two companies myself, and I found an identity that was outside of being a whistleblower. And I'm really glad that I did that. but now I'm at a point where I feel like now that it is in the rearview mirror, that I can embrace it a little bit more without it becoming the entirety of my identity, if that makes sense. So I feel like there's almost like the right amount of space for me to be talking about this right now.
Well, I'm giving a round of applause for like your bravery and all that you've been through, and you are so humble in how you share this experience, Tyler. And it's so, those shades of Theranos are so relatable. So I just want to, I want to give you a virtual hug and thank you on behalf of everyone for sharing this with us. And I'm happy to turn it over to Amy, and I think we have some questions.
We do, and I don't know if you've been tracking in some of the chat here, but Tyler, you're getting a lot of support from the audience that's with us today.
Thank you.
I think we all thank you for your generosity in telling your story. We do have a few questions here. I'm going to scan and pick out a few. There was an interesting one in the Q&A box about whether or not, Tyler, you had any inclination of the company culture before you joined Theranos. I know you walked through a few of the red flags that you experienced even in your first week after joining the company. But I think more importantly, the second part of this question, what signs of company culture would you look out for in the future before joining another company? Right. And I know you just mentioned a few that you did join post your Theranos experience. What can you share related to that?
Yeah, that is a great question. What would I look out for? Number one would be the NDAs. So there's no way that I would ever sign an NDA like the one I signed when I first joined Theranos. The one that I signed without thinking about it. The one that I didn't even read. I would never ever join a company that had an NDA like that ever again. I just flat out would not do it. But unfortunately, I don't think until you've lived with the scars of those types of NDAs, I don't think people really like. I don't think that would be a deal breaker for most people, unfortunately. But the other number one thing that I would look at is company turnover, which can be really, really hard to find unless you know somebody there. But like at Theranos, we weren't even allowed to put Theranos on our LinkedIn page. So you weren't even allowed to say that you worked at the company, which would make it very hard for anyone to go discover how what the company turnover looked like. But by the time I left after 8 months, I was one of the most seasoned people there. That's how fast the turnover was. Like people would come, they would get burned out, they would leave within a matter of months, like over and over and over again. And I would have like, if you can find someone you know at the company and go talk to them about company turnover, that's probably the best way to get an understanding. But if people don't want to stay at a company, you probably don't want to join the company.
What about
I,
you know,
one more thing, I would also pay a lot of attention to silos. So like one thing that Theranos did so aggressively was have locked doors, they had barricades. They made it clear that you were not supposed to talk to your colleagues about what you were working on. And at the time, it didn't raise as big of a red flag for me as it should have. Like Elizabeth had good, I would say, excuses for needing to be so secretive. But really, those things were in place to prevent people from connecting dots. And that is a huge, huge red flag. When you stick people in these silos, um, it's just hard to do good science and good work when you're working in a complete silo. And you need to think about really what is the real reason why they don't want you to perform optimally in order to keep you in these silos.
I have maybe two follow-ups to that for you. The first is, what about documents like the company's code of conduct or their website, or perhaps they have a page going into detail about company values? Are those things that you would consider, and what would you be looking for when you're reviewing those types of documents as well?
Yeah, that's a great point. Company values and code of conduct are so, so important. Theranos did not have any company values or a code of conduct, as far as I'm aware. If they had them, they were not communicated at all, because I'm pretty sure they didn't exist. And I do think it is really, really important, especially in the world that I'm living in startups, to have core values, because you need those core values to help coordinate decision making. You need people to say, like, what is value to this, what is most valuable to the company in this specific situation, and be able to rely on those core values to help them make those decisions. And when you're in a true ethical conflict is when those core values are in conflict with one another, and you have to choose which core value is going to win out. And that's when you need to be able to have a really open discussion with the leaders of your company about how to handle those specific situations. So I think having the core values also gives you a shared language by which to discuss potentially sticky situations that you encounter in your job.
And just going back, the second part I have for the follow-up, going back to this audience question, right? When you're considering joining a company and you're trying to evaluate, get more information about that company culture, can you think of any questions you might ask that would help you get to some of this information? I know some of what you just shared, there's a fine line of what you can find out in advance versus what you're experiencing once you're already inside of the company or functioning in your role. Anything you can offer the audience there?
So if I were interviewing, the number one question I would ask about company culture would just be, what are your core values? And if the interviewer can't name them, like right off the bat, that's a huge red flag, because it means they're not cared about, they're not actually communicated. It should only be like 3 or 4 words that should be relatively easy to remember. And so if enough time has passed since they've last heard those 4 words, then values aren't very important to that company. So that is the number one question that I would ask.
Terrific. There's another question in the Q&A box here. Will it get harder? I think, Tyler, from your unique perspective here, will it get harder to encourage people to speak up in the current environment in the US? I think the question here is getting at under some of the actions from the current administration.
It's a really great question. It's a sad question. I think if you're a government whistleblower, absolutely. I think it's always dangerous to be a government whistleblower. It's probably never been more dangerous than it is right now in the United States. So unfortunately, I do think it will be tougher, and there will be potentially fewer whistleblowers from the government. However, on the flip side, you see Doge being all about reducing fraud, waste, and abuse, right? The best way to do that would be through whistleblowing channels. So I'm optimistic that even though I don't necessarily agree with the tactics of Doge, that they will see that whistleblowers are incredibly important to that type of work. And who knows, maybe they will implement some whistleblower channels in the various organizations, and maybe companies will follow suit. The problem that I see with whistleblowers more in the private sector is that if laws and regulations are toned down or repealed or not enforced, then the question becomes, what do you blow the whistle on if there's just a lot less that is illegal? And it will almost be more like whistleblowers blowing the whistle on negative impacts versus actual breaking versus the actual laws that are being broken. And in that case, what you'll need is really good reporters, and you'll need the public outrage to then influence the company. Like, you'll need people to say, I don't want to work with this company because of the negative impact that they're having, not necessarily because they've broken a law. Like, maybe it won't be illegal to violate some sort of environmental protection thing anymore, but people can still be outraged that they have gasoline in their drinking water, things like that.
That reputational risk and damage only becomes more heightened and perhaps more important in this type of environment.
Yes, so well said.
Richard, how about for you? I think this is an interesting question from the audience to hear from your perspective as well, especially because you have experience working directly with government prosecutors and regulators as well.
Yeah, I think that it's a difficult question. I think Tyler was right. Like, are people speaking up because of the the environment that they're working in, or are they speaking up about fraud, waste, and misconduct, right? So I'm almost reticent to answer it because it's such a charged statement, and I think that we're going to have to wait and see. But where we have the Office of Inspector Generals and we have the reporting lines that are there to facilitate this type of reporting, I think Tyler's right. Like, are they going to get thrown by the wayside in some of these efforts, or are they going to get strengthened? Because Tyler's right. If you really want to get rid of fraud, waste, misconduct, like, you have to have the channels to do it. But if those channels aren't resourced, and that's yet to be determined, it's all about, is it even available anymore? So, I think watch this space.
Yeah, and I know that there's some potential threats against the False Claims Act in the United States right now, which has empowered a lot of whistleblowers. So if something like that is taken away, that would have a huge negative impact on whistleblowers in the private sector.
Yeah, and I think last year was like the second biggest year for false act claims and collections from the civil division. It was huge. So that's a good, canary in the coal mine in terms of what's going to go on with the False Claims Act.
We're already at the time.
Okay.
We need to be wrapping up and providing some final thoughts. The hour has gone by so fast, and I will apologize to the audience. We did not get through all of the questions. There's a lot in here, but we are tracking them, and I think we will be able to address some of these questions in the follow-up resources that we'll be sending out to everyone. Before I transition right to the final wrap up here, maybe Tyler or Richard, just 1 minute. Any final thoughts? Something you would share with our audience here of senior ethics and compliance professionals that they should be considering about their own organizations?
Yeah, just to quickly wrap up, I would say, you need to flex your ethics muscles. And so take every opportunity, big or small, in both your personal and professional lives to look at challenges as opportunities to flex those ethical muscles. And that's how you build strength. And so I hope you're all doing this in your organization, and it will be beneficial to you in the long term.
I think Tyler gave us a great challenge. What's the shade of Theranos in your organization? What's the open secret? Where's the dangerous silence? I think if you start there, and then you can develop Tyler's superpower of knowing what your people are thinking. Great words of wisdom, Tyler.
Yes. And so thank you to our two superstar guests today, Richard and Tyler, for sharing so much with us. I will remind everybody that we will be sharing out some resources after the close of the webinar via an email. So you can expect that in your inbox, hopefully within the next 24 hours. And before we officially wrap up, I need to invite back Stefan Lutz, our MIACA representative here, to give the final closing word. Stefan?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amy. I think I'm not visible. I don't know why, but well, anyway, so thanks, Amy. Thanks, LRN, for the organization. Thanks to Richard and Tyler for your time. I mean, it was amazing. It was really relevant. I feel like the importance of speak up, of the compliance culture, and about the tone from the top is really important. That's actually also what MIACA promotes in the MEA region. So MIACA, for everybody who doesn't know it, it's a non-profit organization in the Middle East, in Dubai, promoting the importance of compliance in Africa and Middle East. And whoever thinks that maybe MIACA sounds interesting and you want to be a part of it, you can follow us on LinkedIn. We have a lot of networking events planned in the next couple of months. We have conferences in Africa, in Middle East, together with our partner, Nielsen Smith. And we have a really, really interesting monthly newsletter where you get updates about events, past events, future events, about interesting reads, about interesting webinars. And I hope that many of you will take the chance and follow us on LinkedIn. right now the membership is for free, and I hope also to see one or the other in one of our events in Dubai. And with that, thank you again. Thank you everybody for your time, and yeah, have a good rest of the day, I would say.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Tyler.
Yeah, thank you so
Amy.
much.